Chart here lists all the systems in the body. Now we're not going to go over all these today in great detail, but I just wanted you to get a picture of just how wonderful and amazing the human body is and how all these systems have to work together to keep us alive and at optimum performance and optimum health, and how so many of these are affected by our diet. Alright, now the second part that we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about the individual cell level. So again, just a really brief recap of cellular organization. We start out at the cell. We move into tissue, so that's that group of cells working together. We're going to tie those together and make an organ. We're going to proceed then to an organ system. And then finally an organism. Now this picture here is just a generic cell. It's a pretty good illustration of many of the different parts of a cell, and that's why I like this illustration. So as we proceed on and start to talk about different functions and different parts, you can kind of refer back to this and just kind of get a visualization of the parts we're talking about. It makes it a little less abstract. So just to talk for a second about the history of the cell. Again, it's the basic unit of an organism. Cells have always been around, but we didn't know about cells until we had the microscope. This gentleman pictured here discovered cells in the 1600s. His name was Anton von Leeuwenhoek, and he described cells in a journal he kept. He had a microscope, and he just kind of started looking at things, everything he could find, kind of like a kid with a new bike. And he stumbled upon plants, and he said, this is interesting. There's different parts to the plant. And that's how he first discovered cells. Now, once we have discovered something new, scientists like to talk about things and hash things out and experiment with things. And the byproduct of all those conversations where we developed something called the cell theory. Now the cell theory is only 3 parts long, so it's not anything horrible to have to deal with or memorize. And the first part of it is that all organisms are made up of one or more cells. The second part is that the cell is the basic unit of life for organisms. And the third part is that cells are made from other cells. So it's pretty short and sweet and simple. Now, there are 2 different types of cells, so we're going to discuss them today. First one is called prokaryotes. Now, they don't have a whole lot of internal organization within the cell. They're very plain. If you kind of look at this picture, it's kind of like one thing, one picture. When you see another picture of the second type of cell, you're going to see it has much more structure. It doesn't really have a nucleus. Now, the nucleus is the center part of the cell. It would normally be somewhere up in here. And that's kind of like the command center of the cell. It regulates a lot of the different functions of the cell. Now most prokaryotes are actually single-celled organisms too. Sometimes in the biological world we call them unicellular organisms. An example of one of these type of cells is bacteria. Now the second type of cell is called a eukaryote. Now these are very organized cells. As a matter of fact, that picture when we first started this lecture on cells, where I told you it was a good generic cell, that was really a picture of a eukaryote cell. They have internal structures, and again we call those organelles, which means small organs or tiny organs. They do have a true nucleus, so they have a center part of the cell. And they can be unicellular or multicellular, so they can either have one cell or more. An example of a unicellular eukaryote would be like yeast, and an example of, say, a multicellular eukaryote would be something like plants and animals. Alright. Now when we talk about cells, they have to have certain boundaries established. So in that type of cell, the complex cell, the way we have a boundary is we have something called a plasma membrane. Now, what the plasma membrane simply is it protects the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. Now, it's what we call a semi-permeable membrane. That means that it allows stuff to come in and out of the cell. But it's able to regulate what goes in and what goes out. It doesn't just open the doors wide and let whatever it wants come in and let whatever it's produced leave in an unlimited quantity, because that would be destructive in nature. Now, we also have a term called a cell wall. Now, that surrounds kind of the plasma membrane. It's generally seen only in plants, bacteria, and fungi. Now, when we get into the eukaryotic cells, it's important to know that we do have a control center as well. Okay? And that's the nucleus that we talked about briefly. The nucleus regulates cell function. It's surrounded by a double-layered membrane, and again, it has large pores. So it also is semi-permeable, and it allows things to go in and out of the cell. It does contain a substance called chromatin as well, which is a long string of something called DNA, deoxynucleic acid. It's a building block of your body. It's a blueprint. When we get enough of that chromatin together, kind of like we took a few marbles, that's chromatin. When we take a bunch of those marbles, we put it together, we have something called a chromosome. Now, we also have another control called the nucleolus. Now, this is actually found inside the nucleus, and its real job is just to regulate something called ribosomes. Okay? Ribosomes are the place where proteins are made. We are made of proteins, so it's essential that we have enough ribosomes, and we also have something that controls ribosome production so we don't make too many proteins. Now, when we also get into the cell, we should talk a little bit about the assembly parts of the cell. Basically, inside the cell we have the organelles, the parts of the cell, and then what they kind of sit in is this jelly-like material that we call a cytoplasm. The main purpose of the cytoplasm is to protect those organelles and to keep them where they're at. If we didn't have anything in there to kind of hold on to them, they just float around within the cell, and that wouldn't work out very well at all. Now, within the cell, we do have to have a transportation system. We need to be able to get things from one part of the cell to the other part of the cell. Okay? The endoplasmic reticulum, then, is the first part of the transportation system. It's kind of like a folded membrane, and it really just is a delivery system, like I said. Now, there's two parts to the endoplasmic reticulum. There's the smooth and the rough. Many times it would be called the smooth ER and the rough ER. If we were to look at these under a microscope, we would see that the smooth ER very much looks like almost like a brand new road. It doesn't have any potholes in it. It's entirely smooth. That's the name smooth ER. Now, its main job is to contain certain enzymes that the body uses, the cell uses, to make lipids, which are another term for fat. Now, the rough ER, however, if we were to look at it under a microscope, it looks like that old city road that really needs some repairs. It's got potholes, or sometimes referred to as studs, all throughout the road. What those studs or potholes are things called ribosomes. We talked just a moment about them. That's where the proteins are made. Also in the transportation system of the cell, we have something called the Golgi apparatus. Sometimes we call it the Golgi body. It's more of an older term, but occasionally you may see that term in textbooks. Now, what these are is just a kind of a bunch of bags or sacks, and that's where the newly made parts of the cell, so things that the cells produce, things like lipids, things like proteins, they're packaged and they're sent out to the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane kind of waits, and it's got these, we can sort of think of it kind of like a gated community of the cell, and it's going to allow stuff in and out of the cell. Another way you can look at the Golgi apparatus, sort of like the UPS. It's going to go ahead, it's going to take the stuff that's been made by the cell, it's going to package it up so that when it sends it out of the cell to the rest of the body, it doesn't get gobbled up by the immune system. It puts a marker on it that allows the body to say, oh, that's me. So it lets it go to where it needs to be. Now, also in eukaryotic cells, we do have to have the capability to store things. The first storage unit we have is a vacuole. Basically what a vacuole is a sac that contains things like food, fluids, or waste products. Think of it kind of like a Ziploc bag, if you want, within the cell. Now, the other thing we have for storage is something called the lysosome. What they contain is a digestive enzyme. So its job is to be able to break stuff down into even smaller parts. Now, it can go ahead and fuse with the vacuoles, which makes sense, because the vacuoles contain the small pieces of food, but the lysosomes contain the digestive enzyme. So it can mix together with it, and the digestive enzymes are able to break the food down even to smaller units. Okay? They also have the job of removing old, worn-out organelles or cell parts. Now, the body's going to replace them before it discontinues use of the old one, but it keeps everything fresh and working at its optimum performance. Now, these guys get the unfortunate nickname as the suicide sacs. If something invades the cell and the cell doesn't have the immune response to protect itself, what it will do is it will actually open up these big bags of digestive enzymes, and it will pour that enzyme all over the cell, which of course kills the cell. The whole idea behind this is that in killing itself, though, it also kills the invader, the virus or the bacteria, so that it can't go ahead and spread to other cells and affect the rest of the body. These lysosomes sort of at that point make the cell kind of a martyr with the hope that it stops the process of infection. And then, of course, every cell needs to get energy some way or another. Right here within the eukaryotic cell, we have something called the mitochondria. Okay? Mitochondria are really the powerhouse of the cell. They're the Duracell battery of the cell. That's where all the energy is produced that allows the cell to function, to create all the stuff it needs to create, to expel all the compounds. Everything that the cell does requires energy. And these parts are the parts that make that energy. Now, when we talk about plants and some simple organisms called protists, we also have something called chloroplasts. Now, they kind of are their equivalent of the mitochondria. And what they do is they take light energy in, they go ahead and convert it into chemical energy, and then they can go ahead and store it like a food molecule and use it as they need it. Anything with a chloroplast contains a chemical called chlorophyll. Now, what chlorophyll does is it helps in the conversion process of energy, but it also, when you look at a plant, is that element that gives it that green pigment. Now, a cell needs some sort of structure, just like we need bones to help support our muscles and our skin. So they have something called the cytoskeleton. Now, what it is basically a small network of thin fibrous materials, and what they do is they act as a scaffold of sorts, a structure to help support the organelles. Okay. Now, they contain two different elements to help them in this process. The first one is called microtubule. A microtubule is simply a hollow filament of protein. Think of it kind of like almost like a straw. It has an outside layer, but if you were to put your eye through it, you could look at it with a microscope, you'd see right through it. Now, a microfilament is the second part. Now, what they are is solid, so you can't look through those. They each have their own part in the structure. Sometimes microtubules actually will serve to aid in transportation, and things can go through them to get to other parts of the cell. And then, of course, we do need to move stuff within the cell. When we move stuff in a cell, we use a process called locomotion. We have two different ways, primarily within the cell, that we move stuff around. And the first one is using something called cilia. Cilia are simply short hairs. There's a lot of them. They protrude from the plasma membrane, and they kind of just are in a constant swishing, a coordinated movement. Kind of like a beating action, almost a rhythm of the heart. And they move like small particles around and other stuff around. Now, the other part of locomotion is called the flagella. What they are longer, and there's less of them. And they're a little bit thicker in nature. Kind of, if you were to think of it as sort of like a tadpole in a pond. If you were to watch its tail, how it's a little thick, and it kind of swishes, and not necessarily a total rhythmic, coordinated action, more of a whip-like action, that would be a flagella. And that's how they move stuff around. And then, of course, we need to be able to replace cells that are dying. So we have a process of cell division that occurs. Now, we lose millions of cells a second. So we have to have the ability to create more cells, but we don't want to create too many cells, and we want to make sure that when we create them, they're good, they're well-rounded, they're proper built, or else we have mutations. Well, we have a part in the cell called the centrioles that maintain this job. What they do is they're made of protein, and they simply go ahead and they play a large role in regulating the splitting of the cell. Make sure it doesn't split too early, too late. It should help keep the boundaries of the cell as well, so it is perfect in nature. Alright, then just to summarize real quickly today, the parts of the cell, we start off with the nucleolus. We have the flagella up here. You can kind of follow the little lines with the term and get a little better picture of what we're talking about. We have the mitochondria, which make the energy. We have the Golgi apparatus, centrioles, cilia, microtubules, the endoplasmic reticulum, the ribosomes, chromosomes, and of course the nucleus of the cell. Now, if you take just a quick glance here, this would be an example of the ribosomes. These little dots here. So that then therefore then is the rough ER. You see the smooth ER kind of along the top and the background a little bit. Alright, well, I've enjoyed this lecture. I hope you've learned